Hello U.S. history students, and welcome to Unit 6, Lesson 1, Totalitarianism and the Outbreak of World War II. Before we begin, it's important to understand what a totalitarianism government is. Basically, this system of government does not allow for any individual freedoms. For example, there is no freedom of speech, no freedom of press, anything like that. And it also seeks to make all aspects of individual life subordinate to the authority of the state. So basically, all aspects of your personal, individual life, businesses, things like that, go through the state. The government controls them. As we well know, World War I was not the war to end all wars. Events between 1919 and 1939 eventually lead to another war, and this begins with the Treaty of Versailles. The punishing, horrible terms of the Treaty of Versailles, your having to give back territory, the war guilt clause, the reparations, all of those forced upon Germany breeds resentment. The Germans are angry. They're frustrated. They don't understand why this is necessary. Those huge reparations that they have to pay also slow their ability to rebuild after the war. So they're not being able to put that money to good use in rebuilding their economy and rebuilding their nation because they got to pay it back to the Allied nations. Britain, France, and other members of the League of Nations say that they want to avoid another war. And that was essentially what Woodrow Wilson sought to do with the creation of the League of Nations. But as we know, the United States doesn't ever join. And the Great Depression being a worldwide event, not only an American-centric event, means no money for rebuilding, because Americans were giving them some money. It got so bad that money was worthless. The German mark, which is the currency for Germany, was literally worthless. To the point where by December of 1923, so well before the Depression starts, well before the war begins, the exchange rate from US dollar to German mark is 4,200,000,000,000 to $1 American dollar. So that means for every $1 American dollar, you had to have over 4 trillion German marks to actually make it worth anything. German currency was literally worth nothing. And this leads to some issues. I mean, to the point where, as you can see in the photograph here, little kids are playing blocks with stacks of German marks. And people were using it to burn in their fireplaces to stay warm. In the 1920s and 30s, nationalism increases. So this pride in one's country around the world really becomes a big deal. And totalitarian dictators become very powerful in Europe. Our first one that we see is Benito Mussolini in Italy, who comes to power in 1922. A couple years later, he's followed by Joseph Stalin in 1924 in the Soviet Union. A little bit later than him is Adolf Hitler in Germany, who becomes chancellor in 1933, followed closely by Francisco Franco in Spain in 1939 and Hideki Tojo in Japan in 1941. These leaders come to power promising their nation's people jobs and promoting nationalism. And in a time where the entire world is in a depression, that promise of a job is going to mean a lot. And a dictator is a person who controls absolutely. So all of these people control entirely on their own. They don't have anybody that helps them really, and they don't have anybody that's equal to them. They control all aspects of the countries by eliminating rivals, denying civil liberties, censorship, secret police, all of these things to control their people. After Vladimir Lenin dies in 1924, Vladimir Lenin being the person who brings communism to the Soviet Union in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. He's this great communist leader that everybody, sees and holds in great esteem. When he dies in 1924, there's a power grab. Who is going to take over for him? Who is going to be his successor? And that ends up falling to a man named Joseph Stalin. Stalin is a communist, and one of his first acts as dictator of the Soviet Union, he takes all property, all farms, all factories, and he takes those into government control. And the whole purpose of this is to control the economy and create equality, which under a communist nation, under a communist government, that's what the purpose is. Everybody is equal, and the government controls all of it. He uses his secret police to basically purge his rivals. So anybody who goes against him, anybody who tries to stand up to him, he kills them. And in all honesty, it's estimated that Stalin either intentionally or inadvertently kills around 9 million people. And he comes to power with a 5-year plan. His 5-year plan is to take this backwoods, farming, agricultural nation to becoming a military and industrial powerhouse in 5 years. It doesn't work in 5 years, but by 1939, he has successfully done this in the Soviet Union. So in a sense, his 5-year plan, while it took longer than 5 years, is successful. But not all totalitarian dictators are communist. And it's important to look at some of the characteristics of these dictators. So they rule with complete power. It's always a single party. They demand the loyalty of their people. They use the police power to control those people. We see an increase in militarism, territorial expansion, so they're wanting more land, and promotion of extreme nationalism. And all of these things are characteristic of a totalitarian dictator. But in the 20s and 30s, we see the rise of fascist governments in Italy and Germany and Spain. And fascist governments are controlled by dictators who demand loyalty from their citizens. They don't offer democracy. The people don't get a say in how the government is run. Again, a dictator is a person who rules absolutely. And they use a single party to rule the nation. Unlike communists, however, fascists believe the people can keep their property, so the government does not take their businesses or their farms or anything like that like they did in the Soviet Union. They're allowed to keep their stuff to an extent. So a couple of basic principles or characteristics of fascism. One is authoritarianism. Strict obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedoms. So this means that you don't have your freedom of speech, your freedom of press, your freedom of religion. The government essentially controls all aspects of your life. The state is more important than the individual. So the government and the nation are more important than each individual person. You've got a very charismatic leader. All of the men that we're talking about right now were very charismatic, and that's how they get people to believe them and buy into what they're selling. And they're very action-oriented. I'm going to do this, and that's going to be it. In the political sphere, they're very nationalist, a very strong belief that their country is the best. In the sense of Nazism, they are racist. A single-party rule with one supreme leader or dictator. All economic functions are controlled by the state. There's a huge amount of censorship, which means the government's going to basically tell you what you can say, what you can read, what you can see. And there's a secret police system that always takes care of what that dictator wants. Socially, they're supported by the middle class, industrialists, and the military. Those are the sections of society that are going to believe in a fascist state. And it's, in some cases, just an extreme version of socialism. In Italy, Mussolini's fascist party seizes power by promising to revive the economy, rebuild the military, and create a new Roman Empire. And this is going to be somewhat of a common theme across Italy and Germany. They want to create newer and better versions of a society that was in the past. And Mussolini is a very charismatic leader. People want to follow him. And he's giving people jobs. He's helping out his people so that they can revive the economy in a time when their economy is really bad. He creates their military and really helps rebuild it. And the people love him. And Hitler really takes a lot of cues from Mussolini. Now, it's very important to understand, Hitler did not create the Nazi Party. He joined it. Now, the Nazis are a fascist group that wants to overthrow the disloyal Weimar Republic. And the Weimar Republic is the basically representative democracy type government that is set up by the Allied powers after World War I. So this is a government that's actually not a German government, but one of more Western ideas. And Hitler, having been a soldier in the German army during World War I, really disagreed with how the Treaty of Versailles treated his nation. He wanders aimlessly around Germany for a while after the war, and then he comes upon the Nazi Party, and he likes what they have to say. And so he's a quick early recruit. He starts to rise to power within their organization to where he becomes a leader within the Nazi Party. And he sees what Mussolini's doing in Italy, and he's really impressed by it. He really likes how he's doing things. And so he takes a lot of what Mussolini says and starts implementing it within the Nazi Party. And he's in this, essentially a bar fight, where he had been at this bar and he was really trying to get people to believe in his ideas and stuff like that. And, well, he gets put in jail. And while he's in jail, he writes, this is back in 1923, he writes this book called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. And in this book, he outlines his ideas and his plans for Germany. He writes in his book that all Germans are members of a master race called the Aryans, and that all non-Aryans are inferior. And he really outlines the Aryans as blonde-haired, blue-eyed, pale-skinned. And if you look at photos of Hitler, he's got dark hair, he's got dark eyes, and olive-complected. He also declares that Germans need Lebensraum, or living space, additional land, and this goes back to the Treaty of Versailles. Because Germany has to give up all of their territory, Hitler believes that they need that space back. They need living space for this Aryan race that is the Germans. So in order to achieve this, they have to conquer Eastern Europe and Russia. And then he called the Treaty of Versailles an outrage. Point blank calls it an outrage. And vows to regain the land taken from Germany after World War I. In 1933, Hitler's named Chancellor, which is essentially the Prime Minister of Germany. He's the leader of Germany. And he uses that power to eventually become a dictator, to become the person that rules absolutely, after the death of Prime Minister Hindenburg, who was his former. Hitler begins immediately putting Germans to work. Again, giving them jobs. They see this as a great thing because the German people have nothing at this point. So he puts them to work. He's building factories, highways, weapons, building up their military, which, if you recall, after the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had to essentially get rid of its military. So he's going to build it back up. And he creates a government protection squad called the SS and a secret police called the Gestapo. And he's going to put these two police forces to work to get rid of his rivals and to control all aspects of Germany. And his ultimate plan is to create what he calls the Third Reich, which is a third German empire. And he believes that he's going to make this the best German empire yet. It's going to last 1,000 years. Which harkens back to what Mussolini's saying in Italy about creating a new Roman Empire. In 1935, Hitler begins a series of anti-Semitic laws. Anti-Semitists basically hate Jewish people. They're anti-Jewish people. And in this, Hitler creates these laws called the Nuremberg Laws. And within these guidelines, they basically deprive all German Jews of the rights of being a citizen. They forbid them to basically for marrying outside of the Jewish faith. So a Catholic German and a Jewish German cannot marry. They also begin to require all German Jews to wear a yellow Star of David with the word Jude in it, Jude, which is the German word for Jew. And they have to sew this on all of their clothing to identify themselves as Jewish people. In 1938, he then orders Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. This is a series of controlled and deliberate attacks on Jewish synagogues and businesses that they literally bomb these businesses. And a synagogue is a Jewish church, and they bomb those as well. After World War I, we turn our attention now to Japan. Japan is the strongest nation in Asia, and they're really ready to conquer new land. Japan is an island with very limited natural resources, and a lot of what they need has to be brought in and imported from like mainland China and such. And so they want to conquer these new lands to provide new resources for the Japanese industry. Very similarly to what the United States is doing when we start taking over territory in the late 19th, early 20th century. They initially begin this by simply needing raw material. And Emperor Hirohito, who is basically the king of Japan, an emperor would be equivalent to a king, gives full control of the Japanese military to Hideki Tojo. And he's not a governmental dictator, but he is a military dictator. Because how Japanese culture works is the people worship the emperor as if he were a god. And so he's divine. The emperor is divine. And the emperor has given this power to this person. And he rules the military system very similar to that of Stalin, Mussolini, and Hitler in their respective countries. So in the 1930s, we see Japan, Italy, and Germany begin to aggressively expand. The purpose of part of these dictatorships is we must take over new territory. Whether it is for raw materials and new resources like that of Japan or Lebensraum in Germany. They need more territory. So in September of 1931, Japan invades Manchuria. And this is the land in far northeast China, right around like North Korea. In October of 1935, Italy starts invading Africa, so where they invade Ethiopia. In March of 1936, Germany invades the Rhineland, which is an area that borders France and Germany. Then in 1937, in July, Japan invades China. Now they're starting to take over mainland China for their resources. In March of 1938, Germany annexes Austria, so Germany brings Austria into their territory. Germany seizes Czechoslovakia in 1939, the Sudetenland in September of 1938, Italy conquers Albania. So all of these dictators are doing everything they can to take over as much land as they can. So we see on this map where Japan is trying to take over. So in 1931, they take over Manchuria, which is right above modern-day Korea. And then in 1937, they move down into the Chinese mainland. As we talked about on our timeline, in 1935, Mussolini gains his campaign and starts creating an Italian empire by invading Ethiopia. So Italy is going south into the African continent. And the League of Nations condemns Japan and Italy. They basically say, you're doing horrible things. Why? How could you do this? But they don't do anything to stop them. They don't do anything to maintain world peace, which is essentially their job. The failure of the League of Nations to stop Italy and Japan gives Hitler the idea, okay, well, if they're just letting them do it, I'm going to do it as well. So by 1936, creating that Lebensraum, that living space for these German people, Hitler expands the military into the Rhineland, which borders France and Germany, part of the land that they had to give back after World War I. And in 1938, they annex Austria and the Sudetenland. So Austria, being a whole separate country, they bring that into Germany, and then they take over the Sudetenland as well. And then in 1939, Hitler invades Czechoslovakia. The League of Nations goes in and tries to use appeasement, which basically they're trying to satisfy Germany, Italy, and Japan to try to avoid war. They're trying to comply with their demands as much as they can so that they can try to avoid a war with those three nations. And as you can see here, Lord Chamberlain, who is the British guy, he's on our side. He meets at the Munich conference in 1938 with Hitler and Mussolini, and he's basically trying to make them happy so that they won't try to fight us. In 1939, Hitler demanded the return on Poland to Germany, but wanted to avoid war with the Soviet Union, because Poland, the land, is in between the two nations. So Stalin and Hitler agree to the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. And this basically means that the two nations are going to divide Poland and agree never to attack each other. So each country gets what they want. They each get a little bit more land, and they promise they're never going to attack each other. They're going to be friends. But on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declare war on the Axis powers. The Axis powers are the bad guys in World War II, Germany, Italy, and Japan. And at that point, World War II had officially begun. When World War II begins, German blitzkrieg tactics lead to the conquest of Poland, and blitzkrieg means lightning war. They're using airplanes to drop bombs. This leads to the conquest of Poland and Denmark, and the Axis powers seize the North African Norway, Netherlands, Belgium, France, and the Balkans. Basically, they're taking over all the possible land that they can because they need living space. They want this territory. And in 1941, Hitler gets really greedy. He basically said, I'm not going to attack you. That's what he's telling Stalin. They make this pact. They make this agreement. They're friends. But Hitler gets too greedy. So in 1941, Hitler breaks the Nazi-Soviet pact and invades the Soviet Union. basically he stabs his friend Stalin in the back. He's like, hey man, I promised I wouldn't do this, but you know what? I need land. By 1941, Germany and Italy controlled most of Europe and North Africa. If you look at our map on the top left, all of that orange either belongs to Italy or Germany. And Japan has conquered more new territory in Asia, threatening Guam and the Philippines, which, if you recall back to our America Becomes a World Power unit, those are United States territories. Guam is our territory and the Philippines is our protectorate. So now they're invading on our land. From 1939 to 1941, the U.S. remains neutral. We're not getting involved. Kind of like we tried to do in World War I. But we are not isolated from this global conflict. And in Unit 6, Lesson 2, we're going to look at the American responses to these dictators and all of the things that we see them doing. So that'll do it for Unit 6, Lesson 1. I hope you have a great day.